Welcome to the Classical Commons Podcast, a conversation exploring the ideas, people, and trends in classical education. And I'm Rob Jackson, founder of this digital platform connecting classical schools to talent and resources nationwide. Today's guest is a philosopher, professor, and scholar whose work encompasses a wide range of topics, including the demands of virtue, knowledge and belief, ignorance and awareness, and, well, a host of other related topics that we'll get into. Currently an assistant professor at the Ohio State University, Wes Siscoe has taught at several institutions, Bowling Green State, University of Notre Dame, University of Cologne, and a few others. But his work, particularly his work on the Philosophy as a Way of Life project and the Philosophy Teaching Library, were really interesting to me. And I thought we should probably bring him on here to come and discuss that work and let us know what motivates him, that brings this philosophy into the public square. Hey, welcome, Wes. Great to have you with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
You know, for all of your bona fides, and they are thick, rich, it looks great. Your CV, which of course we'll include and let people take a look at, is really robust. But we want to get back to the beginnings, right? The sources, as it were. Tell us, if you will, how you became a philosopher. What prompted you, right, to get interested in this rather rarefied stuff?
Yeah, so in some respects, it came kind of naturally. So my dad, when I was growing up, he was a Baptist pastor. He's now retired from that. He's a marriage counselor. And he had this, in his office, he had this huge library, this wall of books, right? And I was, kind of curious, interested kid. So I just started reading, right? And I came up with, quite a few questions. Ones that I didn't really understand at the time were, philosophical questions, but were philosophy nonetheless. When I went to undergrad, I actually still had no idea what philosophy was, and took an intro to philosophy class, and was like there. I was like, oh, I finally found my people. And when I told my mom about this, that I was going to switch to a philosophy major, most parents would be like mortified. They'd be like, oh, great, here comes the struggling teen coming back, 25 years old, he lives in our basement, sort of thing. And she was just like, all she said was, that makes sense.
She had you pegged, huh? She had you pegged.
She's like, you know what? Like, that makes sense. She didn't plan it for me that way, but she's like, I see why that happened. And so I was just interested in these big philosophical questions, right? Like, does God exist? Like, is religious belief rational? How does it compare to scientific beliefs? Is morality objective, or do we just kind of make up our own values? All these big philosophical questions. And so, I just found the questions and like the proposed answers just completely fascinating. Yeah. And so I just dove right in.
I love it. Well, clearly with that inquisitive mind of yours, Mom knew what you were up to, expected it perhaps. As you got into the study of philosophy, especially in the post-secondary grades at college, maybe even in grad school, what were some of the more interesting twists and turns that you found in the formal study of philosophy? Because the questions, that's the beginning point. That makes sense, right? But I'm sure there were things you didn't necessarily expect. What were some of those more interesting developments?
So when I finished undergrad, I didn't go to grad school right away. I didn't immediately pursue a PhD in philosophy. And part of what I was worried about is once you're in just a pattern of, oh, well, I study and I take tests and, I read things and I write papers, it's easy to just kind of continue doing that. And so to not have like a definite plan and just, forge ahead to grad school didn't seem like the best thing. And so at that point, I took a couple of years and I taught actually math with Teach for America.
Oh, yeah.
So this was in Holly Springs, Mississippi. I taught junior high 1 year, junior high math, and then high school math. And there was a way in which like this was great in that, we were making a difference. We were doing really important work. The students were at first not very motivated, but then when they, as they came to see the vision of what we were doing, they became excited about that. The school's definitely, the school that I worked at was kind of on the rise, and Teach for America was a large part of that. So that was really great to be a part of. And so I go from this very, inspiring teaching context to then teaching at like the college level, starting out as a teacher's aide and then, and finally teaching my own classes. And I'll never forget one of the first classes I was a TA for at the college level. So this was at University of Arizona where I got my PhD. It was this logic class, and it was this huge logic class, 150, 200 students. And they were mostly there because they wanted to get out of a math requirement.
This with the math teacher as their TA, right?
That's right. That's right. And the professor was kind of nearing the end of his career. He wasn't that interested in holding the students to high standards. I remember at one point he told me, I don't care if they cheat. So I went from this like very inspiring teaching context, right, where it wasn't what I studied in undergrad, like I was good enough at math to, teach the order of operations. But beyond that, it wasn't what I was most excited about. But then you contrast the teaching, right, where I'm like teaching this, really big class, like students are not excited to be there. The professor is not excited to be there, right? And I'm just thinking, wow, like something's clearly gone wrong because the questions I cared about as an undergrad in philosophy, like I thought those were big, exciting, and interesting. And this is everything but. And so that was a really discouraging kind of like first step into higher education.
And in as much as, again, they took the course, these students took the course to avoid the math requirement. How did that sit with you? I mean, again, I know you weren't a math major as such, but you realized that they were probably only going to have to do college algebra or something, some sort of minimum requirement. Was there any way in which logic, as you taught it or as you assisted the professor, became a little more? Were you able to somehow sway them to understand, in fact, this is a part of what you're made for? Your mind is designed, right, with this hunger for apprehending the forms and the shape and the logical connections. Did you see anything there? Were you able to contribute anything, again, in spite of the professors ready to get out the door?
Well, the students thought that I was a great teacher because when contrasted with the professor from the class, like obviously I was thriving, right? So they're like, so the way the class is structured is on Monday and Wednesday, they would have the normal lecture. And then on Friday, we'd have discussion section, which I led. And they're like, you got to come to the discussion section because that's when you actually learn everything, right? And so they love that. They love having the one-on-one contact with me. But at the same time, I wasn't able to do much in that, very limited amount of time. I had to try and this is what you need to know for the test. And along with that, like, here are the deeper reasons why you might care about it. And so I think that really sent me like on a path of looking at, okay, like what would it look like to teach philosophy really well in higher education and just in general? And like, what's kind of gone wrong here? Like, what are we doing wrong? And how has this approach got to a place where students like don't even care about the subject matter?
That's right. What's so interesting is sometimes these anti-examples do serve a purpose, and maybe you needed to see that, right? Just
Absolutely.
so that you could sort of sign on to bring about change. And one of the ways you did that eventually, after, and I guess as a part of grad school, was getting involved with what is known as the philosophy as a way of life. Let's see if I can pull this up on the screen here. There we go. This is the main page for Philosophy as a Way of Life. It's hosted at the University of Notre Dame, and you got involved with this. Maybe you just give us a little bit of the backstory, because this seems like a progression in your development, taking philosophy out of, again, that rarefied air and into a more ordinary, kind of commonplace circumstance. How'd you get involved?
Yeah, so this partly came out of my frustration with that kind of TA experience. And I was thinking, look, like the questions I really cared about as an undergrad that I found really interesting, like those were, not kind of front and center in the philosophy class that I helped out with. Granted, it was a logic class, but, there was no sense that this had like some deeper like purpose or meaning, what we were doing in the classroom. And I think that even though many philosophers like don't mean to do this can happen when students come in the classroom and you start asking these very abstract theoretical questions. They don't really understand like why you're doing that, especially because many of the questions they think there's like an obvious answer, right? And so they think like, okay, like why are we questioning everything? Like what's the purpose of this? And the Philosophy as a Way of Life project I found interesting because what they wanted to do with that project is point out like, look, there have been so many traditions in philosophy that have treated philosophy as informing your everyday life, right? So if you think maybe most paradigmatically of the Stoics, right? So it's not just that they had all these abstract ideas about the way the world worked. They also saw them as like, oh, and this is how you should live your life in response to these ideas, right? And so they were thinking, not only does philosophical reflection help us think about some of the deepest puzzles of human existence, but it also helps us reflect on how to live a good human life.
Yeah.
And so that was extremely attractive because now I'm like, okay, here are the questions I kind of originally cared about, but here's an approach where we can make it clear to students why those questions matter.
It's interesting to me because it seems like there might be something intrinsic to philosophy, or at least philosophy as it's been played out over the last, I don't know, century or two, that suggests this this disparity, or maybe this sort of dichotomy between the theoretical and the practical. And here you are citing the Stoics and others trying to bring together greater integrity. Am I on to something? I mean, is there something of a divide, at least a perceptual divide between the theoretical and the practical?
I think that a lot of what has happened has been just the kind of thrust of higher education in general, right? So in order to get into higher education, in order to become a professor, you need to specialize very, very narrowly. And so you're thinking about, okay, what is my particular niche within philosophy? And then you start teaching classes in that niche, right? And now you're an expert, not in just like, philosophy generally, and like thinking about philosophy as maybe an approach to living well or an approach to gaining wisdom or something like this. But you're just a specialist in these very like niche debates. And so where do you start? Well, you start by teaching students these niche debates, right? And it's not clear to them from the get-go, like why they should care, right? And maybe to you, it's obvious, like why the questions are interesting because you kind of spent your life on those questions. But to them, it's not nearly as apparent, and it's not like obvious why philosophy in general matters then. So they come out of, they took a philosophy class and they're like, yeah, it was kind of weird. We, talked about some things I've never thought about before, and then I've never thought about them since. So
yeah, right. That's right.
No problem there. Yeah. So
well, and so is such specialization potentially that's damaging for this more philosophical way of life. Do you see a pathway, obviously in the work that you've done under that banner, but do you see a pathway even in the college classroom or in other settings where we can bring these things together so that life as we have to live it as human beings can be informed by philosophy? Are there any sort of practical steps to keeping that together, given, as you say, the tendencies of university to specialize?
So I think that the Philosophy as a Way of Life project has prompted a lot of departments and a lot of universities to do this, right? So when you think about, Ohio State University, it has, a PhD program. It's very focused on, producing a lot of great research in philosophy. And so, it falls into all of these, I guess kind of traps, right? Of, oh, you're teaching these classes on very niche topics. Like it's not necessarily clear to undergrads why it matters. And so what's required is kind of a refocus on undergraduate education and thinking about, okay, what do we want for our undergraduates and how do we lead them through a progression that will actually get them there in kind of a sensible way? Instead of, oh, here's this just like grab bag of courses. Okay, yeah. You took classes on a bunch of niche debates with no idea of how this all fits together, right? And so the Philosophy as a Way of Life project, I think, did a really good job of asking professors and departments to think about, okay, what would it look like for a student to end up as a kind of person you want them to be, a kind of person who philosophy affects their daily life. And so that's one of, I think, the successes of the program, and one thing that, I've been able to kind of bring with me in my work forward as well.
Well, I'm happy to hear it, because I admit, as one who started in the professorate teaching English and education, perhaps because I was teaching future teachers, I was always concerned about the division, or maybe some sort of false dichotomy between what we were studying and what would translate into a classroom. And very fortunately, your approach has led you to get involved with that, which I think could be of great service to teachers, those who are working with kindergartners all the way up to high schoolers, because you've built and co-founded one of these projects there again at Notre Dame called the Philosophy Teaching Library. Could you just tell us a little bit about how you were inspired to get involved in this work?
Yeah, so I first want to, acknowledge the irony of a professor at Ohio State helping out with a project at Notre Dame. It's a little bit of a rivalry there, but
so I've heard.
The project started when I was at Notre Dame, so this is merely a continuation of what came before. But the idea goes something like this. So when we started trying to design these Philosophy as a Way of Life classes, we started to think, okay, what are some of the foundational readings that we want students to do? What's some of the philosophers that we want them to read? And the problem was there was kind of, I guess, two bad options. So one bad option was to just have them read a summary of that philosopher and never read any of the primary texts themselves, right?
Sure.
Feels very inadequate, especially when you're, saying that you're offering, like a liberal arts degree or something, and students aren't actually reading the primary text. Now, on the other hand, if you had students just start with the primary text, a lot of students would be lost. They wouldn't be getting anything out of the reading. They'd stop doing the reading altogether because they were just like, well, they'll have to summarize it in class because no one's really understanding what's going on. So with the library, we tried to, well, this first happened with the Philosophy as a Way of Life project. We just kind of had to create these impromptu readings where we're like, okay, if you're going to read the Nicomachean Ethics Book 1, if you're going to read Thomas Aquinas' 5 Ways, like here is some commentary to go along with the primary text. So we had students reading primary text, but with a lot of support. And so we wanted them obviously to, be acquainted with the primary text, and maybe even as they, advance in their college career to go on to read the text themselves. We wanted them to have a lot of support while they were doing that. So, you didn't have to just summarize everything else again in class, that you could actually get to a higher level of learning in the classroom.
Sure.
And so that's where, we kind of started to develop what would become the philosophy teaching library. At that point, we had, no idea that this is something we would be doing down the road. But then once the Philosophy as a Way of Life grant ended and we were thinking about all these kind of, spin-off projects we want to do, this was one of the most obvious because the readings that we had created had started to become popular throughout the Philosophy as a Way of Life network. People who were not even teaching necessarily philosophy as a way of life classes, as we would understand them, had started to pick up on our readings.
Yeah.
And so this was something that we were like, oh, this is clearly a resource that others are interested in.
By the way, was the Philosophy as a Way of Life, that was a network as you describe it, was it primarily to be found on university campuses, or were there other sites? How did that network work?
Yeah, so it was primarily a network of professors.
Okay.
So it was the Philosophy as a Way of Life project was a Mellon-funded project at Notre Dame. And then there were a number of conferences where faculty members got together and, shared ideas and kind of developed this Philosophy as a Way of Life approach together. And so that grant actually ended in 2022. But Megan Sullivan, who was the PI on that grant, she's continued on to do a number of other amazing things. So right now she's doing something called the Signature Course Fellowship at Notre Dame, which is the Signature Course Fellowship. It's interdisciplinary. It's not just focused on philosophy, but basically they're creating courses around like central questions on human flourishing. And this is not just at Notre Dame. Instead, they'll bring faculty members from across the country to create these kind of big, signature courses on these kind of questions in human flourishing. And so it's kind of a development of what they were doing with Philosophy as a Way of Life, thinking about how do these questions matter to our students, and how can we design our classes in a way where it immediately makes sense that these questions matter.
So derivative of that, some of you got involved in the Philosophy Teaching Library. And tell me a little more about kind of the inception. What was the idea? You were taking readings from the tradition, the sort of primary sources, surrounding them with some of the secondary literature, some of the scholarship and so forth that helped to provide interpretation. And where was this headed? As in, what was this library? Who was aiming to serve?
Yeah, so we wanted to reach these students who were maybe interested in philosophy, but didn't have kind of the chops to read the primary text on their own yet.
Okay.
So we were thinking kind of later high school, advanced high school, early college. That was kind of our target demographic. And we were thinking that this could be something that people could access on their own, or that professors and teachers could assign in their classroom. So if you go ahead and you click on the library, you'll see that there's a way that you can, search by topic, by author. It's easy to find kind of everything you want. And if you scroll down, we can look at one of the individual pieces and we can see how exactly we are laying things out. So at the beginning, you kind of have an overview of what's going on. So you'll get a little bit of introductory material motivating the text, why it's important, what the kind of questions the author's trying to answer. And then you'll get many things you might see in a textbook, right? So you see what are some key concepts, and then those are scattered throughout the piece. But then the goal is to get to the primary text itself. So you can kind of see in bold there, we have excerpts of primary text, then bordered by commentary. So as you go throughout the piece, we just have kind of the most important pieces of the primary text, all supported by commentary. so that students are able to learn, kind of the main ideas of these pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And then along with each of these pieces, we include the links to the original works. So once students are kind of like ready, once they've, had these stepping stones to guide them along the way, then they can read the primary text themselves.
Yeah, it seems like the kind of scaffolding that would make more accessible texts that might otherwise be daunting for a high schooler, certainly even for an undergraduate, if they didn't have a little bit of guidance. But how did you select the faculty that were going to contribute? I mean, how did it, obviously some self-selection, but did you put the word out? Did you advertise in the Chronicle of Higher Education? What was your approach?
Yeah, so when it comes to creating academic resources like these, typically, so once you have, like a big popular journal, people will just submit articles to you, right? You don't have to go looking. It's kind of like if people are submitting op-eds to the New York Times or something, and they probably are overwhelmed with submissions and can only accept very few of them. Obviously, we don't have, a glut of submissions that we can't process, but there are scholars who are just interested, and they're like, oh, this is kind of a teaching material that's going to be on my topic of interest. And so this is a good opportunity for me to, get my work out there. And so we started just by approaching individual scholars that we knew worked on the kind of pieces we were interested in. And now we have kind of an open submission system. So any academics who are interested in submitting to the site, they can go to the submissions page and see how our process works. But basically, we're looking for people with advanced degrees in philosophy, political theory, these closely related fields, because we want our readers to be sure that what they're getting is kind of the expert view on these topics. We don't want them to think like, oh, maybe this piece is like of low quality, but this is a good one. We want all of these to be very high quality, and we want to have a process that ensures that. So we not only have kind of an expert author, if you will, but they also go through a process where it's reviewed by other scholars as well, the peer review process.
Sure.
To see if, like not only is it written by someone who has expertise, but it's also evaluated by others who do as well.
I'm sure you're aware, but I've noticed in the last dozen years or so, as I've worked more closely with classical K-12 classical schools, a number of individuals with graduate degrees, terminal degrees, and a good bit of expertise, including publications, have begun to teach at the high school level. I'm wondering, would those individuals potentially be able to submit to the process? Because they are, in fact, doing some of the work that you're describing here for high schoolers, typically, right? Reading Plato, Aristotle, and others, and providing some of the scaffolding, some of the support. Would they be potential be able to submit something to the process, to the peer review process?
Absolutely. So there was a teacher who reached out to me a couple weeks ago. He's a guy I had met at a conference a few years back, and he has his PhD in theology, and he taught at the college level for a little bit, but now he's teaching at the high school level. And he told me the exact story. He's like, look, I was having the students read primary text just kind of like straight, right? And they were really struggling. And so he's like, and then I found your library and it was kind of just right for them.
Yeah.
And so he's someone that we would love to contribute, right? Because he knows exactly where the students are at. He has a sense of what they might be interested in, what kinds of things that they need to support their learning. And so that's exactly the kind of person that we'd be excited to have contribute.
Yeah, it seems like those professors, scholars, or even, again, secondary level teachers who are working with students that they're teaching, right? This is a teaching library. There should be a certain whetstone, a certain sharpening, right, of the mind and thought. If we're going to if you're presenting these materials to an audience of somewhere between, say, 16 and 22-year-olds, right? You're going to want to make sure you're in touch with that demographic, with that cohort. I'm really interested, given that generations shift in their interests, in their the things that they focus on, just sort of the questions that you mentioned at the outset of our conversation. What are some of the most popular topics currently available on the platform?
Yes, we can see, on the back end, like which essays are getting read the most, what topics are of most interest. And it's funny because, this is probably to a large extent, dictated by maybe what professors and teachers are assigning. Mm-hmm. But we've seen kind of the perennial, like who's who of philosophy kind of featured, right? Mm-hmm. So you have Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, you have Plato's Apology, you have Aquinas's Five Ways, you have Descartes' Meditations.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the most assigned texts so far
Yeah.
that we can see. And it could be that these are the texts that the general public's the most interested in as well.
Yeah.
And, it does make sense that there is some overlap there, but you kind of get, these foundational questions answered by, I guess, some of the most foundational authors. So I think that this is, in some ways, a really great start for people in philosophy because, it helps them see, okay, this is how most people come to this topic. This is who they're reading when they first start thinking about it.
Sure.
And then they'll be able to make connections later on if they do move on to reading some of the more contemporary literature.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, again, because of where we're situated here in the late modern era, if there's any way whereby your team sort of sets up or even solicits additional content. And here, again, I'm thinking of whether it's Nietzsche or Kierkegaard from the 19th century or maybe some of the 20th century existentialists. These voices are significantly influential, again, in this latter half of modernity, and are of significant influence, right, in the academy, and they may be worthwhile. Are there ways in which your team is planning to solicit any gaps or fill any gaps as you go?
So this is one thing we've encountered with our open submission model, where to a large extent, what our content is dictated by just what people bring to us.
Yeah.
And obviously that brings with it certain challenges like the ones you were talking about, where, well, what if there's content, people want, but no authors are bringing it to us? This is, I think, it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. And it's an opportunity in that it allows us to apply for funding outside the library to bring these pieces to audiences. So one thing that we've been working on, so the Institute for Humane Studies, they currently have offered us $10,000 to add a lot of material on the classical liberal tradition. So think John Locke, John Stuart Mill, Adam Smith, these sorts of authors. And so we're thinking, okay, well, a good strategy moving forward will be to identify these gaps and then identify particular, like funders and granting agencies that might be interested in bringing this content to the library.
Sure.
So this could be, we've received grants from the American Philosophical Association, recently received grants from the Society for American Pragmatism. So there are a number of societies and associations that might be interested in funding these sorts of pieces. And I think that will enable us to kind of fill these gaps that you're talking about that come from our, like open submission model.
Sure. And I certainly don't mean to be too much of the contemporaneous, requesting more of the more immediate and modern. It's just that those are voices that young people are likely to encounter in college and probably could use some guidance with. I'm also interested, as you can imagine, given the tradition of K-12 classical liberal arts education, in where the medievals fit in this work. I'm a big fan of Mary Carruthers and others who have really brought to our attention the power of memory and rhetoric and these types of things. And again, there are philosophers, Hugh of St. Victor and others, who have made a significant contribution. You mentioned Thomas, of course, St. Thomas, but he is in conversations with Averroes and Maimonides and others. Are you planning to try to maintain kind of a whole sweep, including that middle period, which is sometimes, at least in my estimation, overlooked?
That's our plan, yeah. And in the long run, we think that will probably actually be one of the more challenging periods to get authors for, right? Because many authors working in that period, there are so few of them, they're kind of already overwhelmed with projects, right? So while, it might be easier to fill in the more recent gaps in the library and find people who are willing to write on those topics, it will probably remain difficult to find people who are writing in the medieval era. So that will kind of be an ongoing challenge for us. It'll be interesting to see, we've just been in existence just over a year now. We're close to, like 30 pieces, right? We have several on Aquinas, being from Notre Dame, but to kind of fill in these gaps in a way that makes sense and allows students to access some of these most important primary texts, I think that's going to be one of our bigger challenges moving forward.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned it, because part of what we hope to see at Classical Commons is some real synergy develop between the K-12 communities, where we do have some who are fairly advanced in their study of the subjects and specifically the philosophic dimension of our work, and who might at some point make a contribution to the work that you're doing. Tell us just, if you can, where you'd like to see the project move in the next 2 to 3 years. What are your ambitions here at this stage? Because you are only a year in, and here I am asking you to cover the whole sweep of philosophic history. So I got to give you a moment to catch your sea legs, right?
Well, we will say that we've been just like very, very, I guess, like pleasantly surprised with the response, right? So we knew that there was this demand. We knew that, there was this need for things that have primary text, but also help students understand them. But we weren't sure like how quickly it would take off. Like, what would it take for us to get up and running? And we've gone from, in the first month of our existence, we had, maybe 3,000 to 4,000 readers. And then now, just 1 year later, we have 10 to 11,000 readers a month.
Oh, wow.
So it seems like our trajectory is really great, and I think that as we continue to add pieces, that will only improve. And then there's kind of this virtuous circle, right? So once you have so many readers, and you look to some of these granting agencies, and then say, hey, look, we have 10,000 visitors a month, over 100,000 visitors a year. They're like, oh yeah, this is a project I'm willing to invest in. Yeah. And so that's going to work out really well for us. I think that we'll be able to get funders excited about, if they want to get their content out there, they don't need to, create their own website. They don't need to create their own way of distributing it. We can distribute it so long as they're interested in funding scholars to write on it.
That's a remarkable story of growth. I'm so excited for what you're doing, as I think it will really advance liberal arts education. I'm also noting that you have a day job, as I see here. You're associated with the Salmon P. Chase Center at the Ohio State University, which is a relatively new entity. How does that fit? Do you see connection between what you're doing with the philosophy library and the work at the Salmon Chase Center?
So the Salmon P. Chase Center at Ohio State, we're working a lot in kind of the civic education space. So that's one of the reasons that the center was created, was to help students learn about the American founding, to learn about some of the kind of most influential philosophical ideas that went into that founding, and then to develop as overall citizens. And it fit really nicely with my, kind of philosophy as a way of life emphasis, right? Learning about these, historical philosophical ideas should just stop there, right? I understand it. I got my A on the test. Now I'm never going to think about it again. It's actually going to inform, the kind of communities you want to build and the kind of life you want to live in that sense. And so that's one reason I'm excited to be part of the center. But another reason is that we ourselves are very interested in classical education. So over the summer, we had a conference for Ohio classical educators, and I think that's a conference we plan on having regularly. Our director, Lee Strang, he helped found a classical school in Toledo. So we have a lot of connections with classical education, and we're thinking about how can we best support classical educators, not just in terms of this conference, but should we be producing resources for them? Should we be creating the kinds of programs for classical educators? And so this is a space we're looking forward to really supporting moving forward.
That's such good news. Good news for Ohio, and I suspect for other states as well, as we take a look at how the Chase Center really develops and your work continues to extend to others. Are there particular publications or other elements of what you're doing, either with the philosophy library or there at Ohio State, that would be helpful for teachers, for leaders, for parents? What should they be looking for? Those who are involved in classical education are always looking for better resources. And I just want to leave you with kind of a last word on any advice or suggestions that you have for them as they want to go deeper in a practical, if you will, a practical study of philosophy, again, as it relates to K-12 classical education.
So one thing we didn't mention yet about the philosophy teaching library is that we try to embed a number of resources within each piece. So near the beginning of each piece, we have not only the title and obviously the author of each of these pieces, but we actually have the original text that we're drawing from, whether that's the original text itself or a translation. So if you go to the piece and you say, oh, I want to learn more, I want my students to read more of this primary text, there is a link within the text that goes directly to where we're drawing from. Yeah. So there's not only that, but as you go through the readings as well, you'll see a link to a number of extra resources. So it's not just, okay, you come, you kind of get a rough overview, and then you have to go looking elsewhere for yourself. But we provide links to other things that can help you to go more in depth. So that's what I would say. I would say start, with the philosophy teaching library piece, and then from there you're going to find a lot of resources that can support your teaching.
Wes, I can't believe 10,000 readers. That's really remarkable. And that's a year into it. So can we go ahead and just plan about a year from now, October 26th, we'll get back together and we'll tell me of the latest and just how far this is going. And I hope
20,000, 30,000.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Just keep that growth, that growth. So thankful that you could join us today and just delighted in what you're doing with the Philosophy Teaching Library. We'll get all the details, some more show notes for our audience. You can send along and we'll post those with this as well. If anybody wants to make contact, again, they can go straight to that website, right? The Philosophy Teaching Library. Give us that URL one more time.
Oh man, I'm gonna have to look at it here. It's philolibrary.crc.nd.edu. So
All right.
philolibrary.crc.nd.edu.
All right. We're going to send as many folks as we can your way and just pray that you continue to produce this good work. So helpful. We're so grateful that you could join us today, Wes. And
absolutely.
Best of luck with your work. Join us weekly on the Classical Commons podcast for updates on this renaissance in classical liberal arts education. Subscribe to our podcast and sign up for our newsletter.